Um, Today, it's a great pleasure for me to have Bryan Turner, the eminent sociologist of religion, with me and speaking to me about his research. It is a tremendously incredible career looking over your files, looking over your bios, looking over all your publications. I mean, so much to mention. But in in a brief sort of introduction to you, if I may, you are a British Australian sociologist, born in 1945 in Birmingham, England, and you've held various positions around the world: England, Scotland, Australia, Germany, Holland, Singapore, United States. You have been a professor of sociology at Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken, 1998 to 2005. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And researcher and research team leader for the religion cluster at the Asian Research Institute,
Yeah.
the National University of Singapore, 2005 to 2008. It's an incredible career, I have to say. I'm very proud to be speaking with you. It's a tremendous honor, and I welcome you. The list goes on. I can read more and more um, about your achievements, but why don't we begin our conversation by speaking a little bit about your work on Islam? I mean, I'm particularly interested as a scholar that deals with or addresses the phenomenon of Islam. So, if you don't mind, maybe we'll start with, if I may ask, kind of sort of a semi-personal question. What attracted you to investigate Islam, to examine, to study it?
Well, I went to the University of Leeds, which was a Victorian university, not the most prestigious, but it had extremely good staff. And I was fortunate to be trained in comparative religion by a man called Trevor Ling, who was a Buddhist expert and became professor of religion at Manchester. And I remember in one of his lectures, he said that nobody had really commented on Max Weber's views about Islam. And that was a great invitation to a young man to have a go at Weber's view of Islam. And I mean, without going into a great deal of detail, I mean, Weber, like a lot of academics of the time, had a very negative view of Islam. I mean, he called it a warrior religion,
Right.
which neglected the spice trade and the role of Islam as a trading community across much of Asia and the rest of the world, and that Islam, insofar as it's violent, is no more violent or less violent than Christianity. So, there's very little, traction in that kind of debate. And I found Weber's views kind of interesting because of his, views about the relationship between Lutheranism and capitalism at the time.
Right.
And so, because there was very little on Islam, I kind of by accident got into that. The other influence on my life was uh, bumping into Ernest Gellner.
Mhm.
Um, um, I was stupid enough to say, Professor Gellner, I really admire your work. And he said something like, I will not be persuaded or I will not be corrupted. So that was not a good start. But he wrote a very wonderful review of my Islam book, which just started by saying, this is a laudable book, full stop.
Nice.
So I couldn't have had a better book review than Ernest Gellner. And Gellner remained important for me because, and we might get on to this, that
Yes.
Gellner thought that Islam was one of the few religions that would survive modernity,
Mhm.
which was kind of an unusual and, rather unique view to take of the long-term evolution of Islam. So that's the basis of where I began. I suppose the other thing to say was I was at the University of Aberdeen at the time, which had been around for, I don't know, 400 years or something, and had the most wonderful library, which had just about every book on Islam, that you'd ever need. So again, we'll get on to accidents at some stage, but
Yes.
a series of accidents. I just got a wonderful start.
Well, that sounds incredibly fascinating. And you're right about the review. I mean, I like that short and powerful review from an incredibly daunting man. Um, why don't we actually, if you don't mind, um, since you mentioned a series of accidents, I mean, this is essentially relating to your response to me in that, it was a series of accidents really that got you involved in investigating Islam and studying it and trying to understand it. Can I ask you what did you understand by the statement that was made by Gelner, if I remember, about Islam is the one religion that might survive modernity? Would you like to expand on that a little bit, as in comparison to Christianity, Buddhism, or just
Well, it was rather an unusual position to take because
Mhm.
when we got on to Weber, I mean, Weber, interestingly enough, was completely hostile to Lutheranism at a personal level.
Right?
He called Lutheranism the horror of horrors. And he felt that it produced a kind of lonely and anxious personality who constantly asked themselves, am I saved?
Right.
And of course, the measure they took of salvation was, were they rich? So this was the connection between Lutheranism and the growth of capitalism, which was like a religious anxiety. Um, and I should say that I started to go to a Methodist university club. And one of the changes in my life was we went on a bus tour around the whole of Europe, and we went into the Soviet Union.
Wow.
Um, this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
I
My
didn't realize how lucky I was to get home until I got home, but we kept coming across young Russians who wanted our rock and roll music. They wanted to buy our jeans, and so that again was like a bit of an eye opener about. And the bus trip ended in Finland,
right.
and I think I got the name right. Yevtushenko,
Mm.
who was a famous Russian poet, was
Yeah.
reading his poetry at this meeting. So, these were all accidents, but they were very, very fortunate, enriching, um, mind blowing experiences. And I don't know whether, I hope young people have the same kind of opportunities that
Mm.
my generation had. We were the post war, I was just at the beginning of the baby boomers.
Mhm.
And we were much discredited now because of our good luck and,
Yes.
that we were not a very responsible generation. But that's the kind of broad background to how I got into Gelner and Islam and
Mm.
sociology.
Mm.
Because most of the young people on these trips I made were sociologists,
Mhm.
and they were all quite impressive people. So I decided I wanted to be. And we could go into this more, but
Yeah.
Roland Robertson was my lecturer at Leeds.
Right.
And of course, he went on to do globalization and also became a big name in American sociology.
Yes. Yes. That's incredible. In fact, I was intending to kind of begin by asking the question, well, what was it like being uh, growing up in the post-war era, and you kind of gave me a snippet of that. That's really nice. And that those opportunities are priceless, and it would be nice to have more of that for our generation as well.
Yeah,
I feel like in a weird way, even though this is quite a globalized world community, in that we can relatively say travel around the world is
yeah,
more or less easy, but and permissible. But at the same time, I have this feeling that it's probably even harder. And even though we don't have such a thing as the Berlin Wall anymore or Iron Curtain, it feels like as though there is barriers. There are barriers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about it later or whenever. I
Mm.
mean, my nomadic lifestyle of, I think it's 7 countries.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes.
Again, that's rather bizarre, but when I get an offer of something, I tend to say yes, please.
Mhm.
My father was offered a job at Glen Eagles in Scotland next to the Gulf, and he turned it down. And even at my age of 9 or 10, I could see that was a mistake.
Mhm.
Um, and after that, I just said, would you like to go to Singapore? Would you like to go to Germany? Would you like to do this, that, and the other? I mean, I was inclined to say yes.
Right.
It's had kind of its negative downturn, which is that most of my generation that I knew growing up live in England
Yes.
because they never went anywhere. And so I find myself a bit, somewhat isolated, I suppose.
I
I
see.
mean, I'm happy being an Australian, and I think Australia is a good place to live. Um, and ACU has been generous to me, so
Mm.
I don't complain about life.
Were you your decision to come to Australia, was that obviously work based?
Well, there was a colleague at Aberdeen. Oh, well, I'll say that when Mrs. Thatcher came to power, I knew that the future of sociology was limited,
All right.
um, and that sociology departments would be closed down rather than medical schools and so forth.
Yeah.
And there was a colleague of mine at Aberdeen who'd worked in Australia, and I said to him, "What's it like working in Australia?" And he said, "It's wonderful."
Mhm.
So I got offered a job at Flinders University in Australia and went there. I had a bit of a rough time because they were very much anti-British in
Oh,
the
yeah.
sense that we were the
Yes.
colonialists, and
Yes.
we thought of ourselves as superior and so forth.
Right. That's unfortunate. And when you came to Australia, were you working on Islam, or were you just what kind of were you working on sociology of religion, sociology of body? I think was it health, body?
I I got very interested in Foucault
Uh-huh.
and his work on, mental hospitals and prisons and
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yes.
I found interesting,
Of course.
and I thought his attention to the body had been somewhat neglected, and so I got into that. Much more recently, I've become a great fan of Marcel Mauss,
Mhm.
who did this work on body techniques, and so I become kind of interested in that as that's another starting point. And
Okay.
generally speaking, I thought that it was odd to me that medical sociology really didn't focus on the body. I mean,
Mm. Yeah, that is odd.
everything apart from the body.
Yes. No, that is odd. Incredibly
Yeah,
important, right? I mean, we
yeah,
exist in our bodies in society, so
yeah, yeah,
the sociology of body is fundamental in many ways. So let's talk a little bit more about Islam, if you don't mind.
yeah,
So my understanding is that you've focused quite a bit on Islam as a religious phenomenon within society. In other words, it's not seen as anything strange or different necessarily, but a religious experience of a people or community. And so a lot of your work has been around sort of discussions and problems to do with citizenship, with globalization, in fact.
Yeah.
Even the dastardly question of secularization. So, if I may throw that in there. And of course, the modernity so-called problem in quotation marks. And I wonder whether it's it's fair to say that in your work, as I understand it, as I've read you, your impression has been that Islam is really no different, and that it has its certain ways of being in society, in relating to others, and that these aren't necessarily, for want of a better word, contra or against modernity, modern values, even secular climate or milieu, in an increasingly globalized world. Now, please feel free to correct me. I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
I hope I got that to some extent right.
Well, I think Islam lays out a collective pattern of religious activity.
Mhm.
Um, and we've just finished a bit of research on Muslim students at ACU and found that they don't suffer from Islamophobia. They they are happy at a Catholic university. They say their daily prayers. They try to use the ablutions in the public toilets, which are not very convenient. Um, they go to the mosque every week. I mean, so they're regularly practicing Muslim students. And part of the argument of this research is that insofar as Muslims become members of the middle class, they become property owners and their children go to university. They become very much integrated. I mean, they're very integrated into Western societies. I mean, we tend to concentrate on. Well, my argument is that sociologists like bad news stories, and we wanted to write some good news stories. I mean, when I open the newspaper in the morning, I expect to see lots of bad news. You know, Trump has done this, the dollar is in decline, the threat of war. We don't expect, the newspaper to say, it's a great day today. The dollar is up, the sun is out, everybody's happy. It never happens.
No, I think that's a good point, and it is fair. You should capture the good as well as the bad, and you can't just always open up the news and see bad stuff. And certainly, I think bad news sells, and that's why that's happening. Uh,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're subjected to the trends of media finance. But I'm a little bit curious about your work, your very early work, Weber and Islam, 1974, in which, this was your first sort of exploration of Islam vis-a-vis Weber and his theories in relation to Islamic societies. And I believe in it, you sort of raised the question or asked the question whether Islam was conducive to capitalism. Is that fair?
Um, well, obviously, Islam was a great trading community,
Hmm.
and it's not quite the same as Max Weber's argument about, the horrors of Lutheranism drove the German bourgeoisie into making a lot of money. Oh, I should throw in that Weber was extremely anti-Catholic. He he thought that the eastern borders of Germany were being corrupted by pleasure-loving Polish Catholics. I mean, Weber didn't know how to enjoy himself until he got to his old age, and so he was essentially a rather depressed character. I think
Mm.
he
So,
didn't like good luck stories.
what was his own religious affiliation?
Well, his mother was a strong Lutheran Protestant. Um, I think his father was a typical German dueling, drinking, you know, womanizer.
Right.
Um, but Weber was very dependent on his mother, I think, and she drilled Lutheranism into him. I mean, his personal life was very disciplined, obviously,
Mm.
apart from his own, mental breakdown. Um,
Mm. Right. Okay. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
um, well, we don't know whether Weber struggled with his own sexuality. I mean, some people have said it was his wife who had problems with sexuality. Of course, Weber had these, love affairs late in life and became addicted to Italy and Goethe and, the Southern way of life, which was very late in his personal life.
Right.
Um, but it's interesting that Germans often flee to Italy to get some relief from,
Right.
the Lutheran discipline.
That's right. Um,
Uh,
this is a common trope also in
uh,
some foreign films too. Yes. Um,
uh,
so in your work on that book, what were some of your clear conclusions? I mean, what did you sort of think after doing that about what were your conclusions about Weber and Islam?
to be honest, I haven't read that book of mine for some time.
I'm
I should
sorry,
have
it's a
done
bit
it
unfair.
today. No, it's okay.
1974.
Um, no, what sticks in my mind is that they weren't any more militaristic than the Christians or anybody else.
Right.
Um, they were very successful at trade.
Yes.
They built great empires. And I'm very interested in 1492,
Hmm.
which is when the Muslims were driven out of what is now Spain,
Yes.
where they'd created this wonderful international community of architects and writers, and I mean it was the kind of jewel of Europe at the time. And then they were driven out, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and proceeded to destroy America, or anyway to colonize America. Um, so I mean, those are the sorts of things I got
Mhm.
interested in. I also sort of tried to get into um, the impact of Islamic philosophy and medicine on the Western world,
Mhm.
and
Oh, yes.
that the conquest of Istanbul and the spread of Islam through the great trading routes of Asia always stuck in my mind. I mean, I think Weber had a very narrow definition of what economic activity was all about.
Yes.
I mean, it was for him, it was capitalism. Um, um, we might get on to talk about the axial age debate, but at the
Yes.
moment, I've been reading stuff on the economic basis of the pre-modern societies. I mean, trade is not a modern development,
Of course.
for
So tell us
example.
about that. What are you up to there?
Well, this axial age debate says that, the great religion started, I mean, if I get the dates right, 600 to 2000 BC. This is when we get Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and
Yes.
so forth.
Yes.
But the axial age debate leaves out Islam and Christianity, which are post-axial, which is kind of inconvenient for the argument about Bella's argument about, you know, well, the argument of Bella and people like that is that
Yes.
thinking about thinking
Yes.
and ideas about transcendence come out of this very early Axial Age period, and that you know, therefore Islam and Christianity again are in a kind of slightly unusual position.
Right.
But Bella, who was a great American sociologist, made his late career out of this axial age debate and the growth of the idea of transcendence and immanence and so forth uh, were part of the modern consciousness.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yes, that's an important point. So, are you in dealing with this axial age hypothesis? Are you trying to bring in Islam and Christianity into this picture in some way?
Well, I point out the anomaly of it,
Hmm.
and that they focus on Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, whatever.
Yes.
Um, but if you wanted, transcendence and immanence and thinking about thinking, you'd have to go to Christianity and Islam, I think.
Yes.
But I'm interested in whatever happened to the pre-axial age religions of the Northern Hemisphere. For
Right.
example, Native Americans who would count as pre-axial. Um, and I've been looking at the universality of the drum in the Northern Hemisphere,
Hmm.
the drum was seen to be the connection between human beings and the drum that is the earth itself, and that the drumming kind of imitated the growth of the world and the growth of humanity, and that our hearts beat in unison with a kind of drum. So I'm interested in Mircea Eliade, the
Yes.
great writer on shamanism,
Yes.
who also said that the defining character of shamanism is the drum, which of course is a kind of universal early form of music, all the way from China to Alaska. And that's kind of what is interesting me at the moment.
Well, I love that. And
And
is this um, part of a particular book that you're writing or a grant research?
well, here's another accidental story. For some reason, as a schoolboy, I became friendly with a man who was an Ojibwa Indian,
Wow.
and he lived in his caravan, and he made war bonnets for the British Museum. And I used to go and sit in his caravan as a schoolboy, watching this Ojibwa Indian make these wonderful war bonnets. Well, as a schoolboy, I mean, what I really wanted was a war bonnet. I never got one of his war bonnets, but
Oh.
this experience of very strange experience. How did a schoolboy become friendly with an Ojibwa Indian who was
Yeah.
making war bonnets for accidents.
Yes.
Um, but also, I kind of seized accidents. I mean, a lot of schoolboys might have said, "Well, that's very interesting, but I'm too frightened to come and sit in your caravan. What will my mother say?" I'm sure my mother never knew that I was sitting in somebody's caravan with an Ojibwa Indian. And I mean, I've been recently reading about the Ojibwa. They're still around. I mean, they survived colonialism and
Mm.
Christianity and all the rest of it. They're still there.
Mhm.
I mean, that's partly what I find amazing.
Mm.
These pre-axial,
Yes. You've just frozen.
nothing is lost in evolution.
No, I agree. So we just kind of lost you for a second. You froze. Um,
Yes, it says my internet connection's a bit
yeah, that's okay.
unstable.
So you were saying that you were brave enough to go into the caravan with the man.
Ojibwa Indian.
Yeah. And what was the outcome of that for that in terms of seizing the accident? What did that mean for you? How did that help you?
Well, when I went to school, I remember soon after that, um, the teacher calls us to the front for a private conversation. And he said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Mhm.
And I said, I want to be an anthropologist.
Wow.
And he was kind of amazed by this because, they were saying things like the other boys were saying, I want to drive a racing car at Monte Carlo, or I want to marry a film,
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
you know, like that.
Yeah.
And for some kid to turn up and say, I want to be an anthropologist, left him a bit stunned, really, I think. Um, I'm not sure he asked me why. I might have said, well, my friend is an Ojibwe Indian.
Mm. But
Uh,
it certainly gave you insight into, or it stayed with you enough to help you with this kind of axial
yeah,
question, right? This kind of pre-axial age
yeah,
experience that, in a strange way, survives through time and into modernity. Um, which is kind of, I mean, when we think about all these kind of patterns, conceptual designs of how history flows and is categorized, it seems almost absurd to me, in a way. And it kind of goes to your point about Islam in that, just reflecting on your work, I can definitely say that. I mean, what it demonstrates to any reader, to me definitely, is that there's just certain historical contingencies at play. They're not necessarily demonstrations that Islam, for instance, is oppositional to capitalism or that it rejects certain values of modernity or whatever. And these are historical accidents, very much to
yes,
your point. And it's I find that far more fascinating than trying to organize history into some kind of routine or into some kind of forced regimen.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just yeah, I find that a little bit. Um,
Well, Roland Robertson, I think I've already said, was
mm,
one of my university teachers. And of course, he became famous for his work on globalization.
yes.
And I, um, I spent quite a lot of time with him. But he was a very, very difficult man. And I think he wanted children with his wife, and she was having difficulty becoming pregnant. And I remember staying at their house once, and Roland drank very heavily, came into the bedroom in the middle of the night and started having an argument with us. Um, I've spent a lot of time in pubs with Roland where he used to get very aggressive with other people drinking around the bar. I'm not sure why people didn't attack him, but anyway, I mean, he was a very clever man. He
Right.
was exceptionally well read,
Yes.
but he had a very difficult personality, I have to say.
Mm.
And I think he got jealous about me because I was his student. And here I was, Cambridge, Singapore, written more books than Roland. And I think it's probably difficult for teachers when their pupils become more famous than they are. I mean, perhaps that's difficult to swallow. I don't know.
Well, we can name quite a lot of famous individuals,
Yeah,
academics whose tutors, mentors we don't know. We
yeah, yeah,
popularly absent in popular knowledge, um, or not aware, not present in popular knowledge. Um, so I think that's just fair. That's just the way it
yeah,
goes. And
yeah,
they should be tremendously proud of that. They can
yeah,
produce such individuals, and he should have been, I think. Bryan, let's turn to some of your recent publications, and one book in particular, which I got hold of and I read,
yeah,
Understanding Islam. This book,
yeah.
published with Edinburgh,
Edinburgh University
yeah,
Press.
Edinburgh University Press, and this was 2023 publication, I believe.
That's right. Yeah,
And in it, you explore. Obviously, see, this is I loved seeing the title, Understanding Islam. I mean, people shy away from this word or frown upon it.
yeah,
You know. it's unnecessarily problematized, but I think it's an essential word and fundamental to anything that we want to deal with and address. So I love that you call it Understanding Islam, and the subtitle is Positions of Knowledge, which is perfectly apt.
Yeah,
Once you read the book, you kind of see that. But yeah, you kind of try and demonstrate how Islam from within and without its tradition, it has political, social, academic contexts that shape the interpretations
yeah,
in the way that it's presented. But obviously, the this issue of positionality, which you raise, which is very important, I might say, in regards to politics or the politics of knowledge and the production of knowledge, therefore, and the way that this has all influenced and shaped Western perceptions of religion and
yeah.
Islam in particular. I I remember you saying that you didn't believe that the book kind of got the recognition it deserved, and I think it deserves more recognition than you say. I think it has done some. It has been well publicized. It's out there, and I think it needs to be more read by our colleagues. Definitely addressed, even if people disagree with some of the things you're saying. But I don't find anything objectionable in it. Um, I think it's incredibly lucid, well written. Yeah. Um, this. Would you like to say anything about this book?
Well, again, it started with an accident, which was I gave a lecture in Germany, I think it was, on Islam,
Right.
and a young American boy got up at the end and said that I was, racist, fascist,
Wow.
colonial, superior, all the bad things.
Wow.
And this was an American, college student from a privileged background who was also, objectionable and all the rest of it. And I mean, the good thing that came out of it was
Mhm.
I felt I had to question my own, you know, taken for granted assumptions.
Mhm.
And that sort of led towards I think the boy said, you need to consider your positionality,
Right.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this stuck in my mind that, I needed to think about what was my position. And I think the book is sort of saying, when we understand, do we stand over or do we stand under? Or do we stand by the side of somebody? And of course, I think the best forms of understanding come from standing beside somebody in a kind of mutual quest for what is true and what is valuable and so on and so forth. And I think one of the influences on me was Gadamer
Yes.
and,
Yes.
the idea of Verstehen and
Mhm.
um, the limitations of Weber's own understanding of Verstände,
Yeah.
sociology.
Yeah.
Um, and the particular problems today of interfaith understanding because of the war in Gaza,
Yes.
the attitude of the Israelis. I mean, Trump in America.
Right.
I mean, the good world of the post-war era seems to have just collapsed, and we don't really know what's going to come next.
Mm.
But it doesn't look too optimistic, I'd have to say.
Okay.
Um, and I think part of the problem in America is to some extent the decline of their own educational system.
Mm. Mm.
So, I think people are prepared to swallow all sorts of lies coming out of Trump. And I think, I don't know if we've said already, the book that's coming out this year is called, um, what's it called? A Sociology of Lies.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes. You mentioned that. Yeah, we should talk about that in a minute. I think, yeah, in terms of the book Understanding Islam, you're kind of so it sort of it still aligns with your work on Weber in Islam, because in that work you're kind of showing how Weber has a very reductionist
Yeah,
narrative perspective, which is generally Eurocentric, whereas
yeah,
understanding Islam, you're trying to demonstrate in a way what Weber should have done.
yeah,
What you're doing is showing how these kind of positions exist and where one stands. Then, therefore, it sort of shapes the way that you see the thing that you're trying to understand, and perhaps that has its own limitations, if I may say, sort of
yeah.
the implication. Yeah, and I can see why you have written the book the way that you have, given the explanation that you gave about the accident.
Or can I just interject that a lot of my thinking goes to St. Paul's observation that, Christianity is foolishness to the Greeks. Um, and I think the idea that God died on a tree, um, you know, frankly, is from a rational point of view difficult to swallow.
Okay.
Um, and moreover, that he rose again on the third day. And, I mean, I'm obviously, I mean, I'm obviously, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Christianity. I mean, I was brought up as a Methodist.
Mhm.
Um, I I kind of drifted into the Anglican Church,
Right.
um, and I no longer go to church. And people say, "Why don't you go to church?" And I say, "Well, I find Anglicanism too compromised by um, well, I mean, the sexual scandals inside the church are,
Right.
enough to kill it. But also the kind of propensity to, abandon the creed and rewrite it to fit a lot. So I'm very fond of Mary Douglas's work on. I mean, she was very critical of the Vatican II
Mm.
transformation of Catholicism.
Yes.
And I'm in a very funny position, and I don't criticize ACU because they're very generous to me. They put up with me. I'm 80 years of age. I'm still working. I'm not Catholic, um, but I kind of avoid criticizing ACU because the students here seem to get a good deal, and ACU produces lots and lots of nurses and teachers and people who are going to useful, places in society. So again, I suppose my resolution in old age is not to complain.
That's a good resolution. I wish I could do that. I'm trying so hard. Every day I wake
Yeah,
up, I'm not going to complain today. But
yeah,
sure,
yeah,
something happens that definitely arouses my anger. Um, uh, Brian, tell me if you don't mind a little bit. To be honest with you, I'm remembering a little. This is an anecdote I have of you. I remember you at Western, because you were at one point the director of the Center for Muslim Societies, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the exact title that it was.
I can't remember the title
Yeah,
either.
it was long. It
I,
was very
I
long.
was a
And
director.
then it became Religion and Society
Yeah,
Research Center, and now it's Religion and Society Cluster. Um, but you were the director, and that's where I first met you.
yeah,
Um, and um, and that was a nice an accident for me, I have to say, because that led to my productivity boosting, and being able to publish.
yeah,
And you encouraged me to publish certain works that I had been sitting on. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. But I remember you at a seminar, I think it was. I can't remember which seminar and what we were talking about, but I distinctly remember your paper, and I remember that you, after you sort of stopped speaking, you kind of began to talk casually to the crowd, and something came up that made you say that you had a certain frustration about, I think it was Anglicanism, and you were talking about Anglicanism.
Yeah.
But at the time, I remember you were sort of very much inclined towards, please correct me if I'm wrong, high Anglicanism. Am I right in
Well,
remembering this?
I was connected. I made friends with the monks in the monastery at Leeds, and these were incredibly intellectual people. I mean, um, they'd read all the theology and the, history and all the rest of it. And I remember my introduction to one of them. I went into his room and he said, "Do you want a fag?" And he lifted up his clothing and produced this, 50 um, box of cigarettes, and we had a fag together. So I found them both extremely spiritual and also very
Mm.
earthly at the same time. But what impressed me was the intellectual depth of these people,
Mm.
and that how widely they read and so forth.
Yeah.
And so the Anglican church at the university was full of these ministers or priests who were intellectuals in their own way. So their sermons were, you know, brilliant lectures in their own right. And so here again was a kind of influence on me.
Mm.
Um, I mean, people ask me why I don't go to the Anglican church, and it's partly a joke. I said I can't find one that's high enough.
I love it. Wow. But raised Methodist, that's how was that?
Yeah, I mean, my parents were not particularly Methodist. Um, my father was a head waiter, so the house was full of wine. I think I've already told you that. And so I was brought up on champagne and caviar. This
Wow.
was a working class home.
Yes.
We had no books, no newspapers, no library, no interest in the news. But there we were sitting, drinking champagne and, and smoked salmon for evening meal and.
Beautiful.
So the cuisine and the actual, intellectual framework was missing.
Hmm.
But I had the good fortune that one of my relatives went to Birmingham University. I think I've already said, she once said to me, "Bryan, why don't you read books?"
Mm.
And, that set me off reading books.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Um, why don't we talk about your latest book, the one that has to do with accidents?
Well, it's one I'm planning anyway,
You're
because,
planning. Sorry. Yes.
yeah. Well, I think I mentioned I got very interested in Tolstoy, partly because Tolstoy influenced Max Weber,
Right.
um, particularly the contrast between an ethic of ultimate ends and an ethic of immediate means and so forth. And Tolstoy wrote this wonderful story, Ivan Illich. I think, have I already said this? And
No, no, it's fine.
it's
No,
the
you haven't.
story of a very influential and famous man who climbs up a ladder to put decorations up for Christmas. He falls off the ladder and dies 3 weeks later, where he spends the 3 weeks thinking about what a miserable life he's led
Mm.
and how pointless it was, and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, it was this story of Ivan Illich that really kind of got me started on, the role of falling off a ladder.
Hmm.
Um, and that my own life seemed to be totally unplanned. It was just one accident after another.
Mm.
Um, and I think my health recently was changed. I was running for a bus, fell off the curb and bashed my head on the road.
Goodness.
And I was very lucky that I did this next to a doctor's surgery.
Wow.
And fortunately, some good Aussies picked me up off the road and put me into the doctor's surgery. And then I went off and had a brain scan, which showed that I was kind of okay.
Oh, good.
But it's left me very nervous about walking.
Mm.
I'm very careful not to fall over again
Mm.
because I don't want another accident, you know.
In a negative sense, yes.
Negative, yeah. But this led me to think about, the whole role of accidents and that there isn't or wasn't a sociology of accident. Because we tend to think in terms of these systemic long-term processes, globalization, modernization, industrialization, secularization.
Yes.
I don't know if historians are more into, discrete accidents. Like the First World War was a kind of accident,
Mm.
um, you know. But
Well,
I read a lot of Hannah Arendt
mm.
on. She said that telling the truth has never been a political virtue, which struck me as, well, heresy. But I mean, it's basically kind of true because she said that the role of the politician is to stay in power.
Mm.
And they typically have to do that by telling lies. Well, Trump has taken telling lies to a new high level.
Right.
Um, so much so that they don't know the difference between, truth and lies and so forth. And that's taken into another thing about, which also is Hannah Arendt, that um, politics has become entertainment.
Mm.
You're mainly successful if you can entertain the crowds.
Mm.
I mean, Trump does that or has done that
Mm.
very successful.
Sure.
Partly because of, You're Fired, The Apprentice. So he
Yes.
has a television presence already.
Yes.
But what worries me about the current generation is that, and my daughter in particular, you know, they get bored easily and they want entertainment.
Yes.
Um, and I can't say to her, "Have you thought of reading Dostoevsky?"
Well, there you go. I think that right there is the problem. Not just the next generation, but my generation. And I mean, I have to say that a lot of what you're saying in terms of, Hannah Arendt's comments in particular is true because politicians, I guess, are smart people. They figured
Yeah,
out that most of the populace is not really interested, even though they sort of feign interest, really in the actual detail of things or in the reality of the fact.
yeah,
Just want to be entertained in a way.
yeah,
No one's going to buy newspapers if they tell the truth, I suppose. And maybe
yeah,
it'll be a very short newspaper or a short article or a
yeah.
very short statement. So, unfortunately, I think news media has become much more about entertainment. And this is increasingly visible and true and demonstrable.
Well,
Um,
I think the same attitude applies to
mm,
undergraduate education to some extent. I
indeed.
mean, I have a colleague at Sussex University in Britain, and
Mm,
she says on day one when they arrive, there's helium balloons up in the university, and nice music, and
yeah.
lots of nice food,
Yeah.
and she's not allowed to fail a student.
Mm,
They all have to pass at some level. And
yeah.
I think some universities, the vice chancellor will say, um, raise lower the rate at which they have to fail. So I mean, the vice chancellor can't tolerate, too many failures because
Mm,
the Senate will want to know what's going on.
mm, mm, mm. The fate of higher education is certainly
Yeah,
uh, grim, if I can put it quite negatively.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's to my chagrin, it's kind of an everyday um, it's an everyday point of
Struggle.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a struggle. And it's a point of reflection which constantly, in a way, depresses me. But not. I mean, I'm not depressed. I'm
yeah,
just being honest.
yeah,
It's kind of a downer, as we would say. because you kind of expect more and you want more from your students, from yourself.
Well,
And
sometimes I get asked to give undergraduate lectures. I don't know if I've already said this.
no, you haven't.
And I've said to the university, you must be joking. I mean,
No.
I can go there and depress all the students if I want.
I
I
think it
can
would
tell
be.
them what a terrible world they're going to live
Oh
in.
no, surely
And
not. Because your next book, the one that you're planning right now about accidents, to me sounds like the book that
uh,
we all need to read. Because how else are we to understand this world rather than fooling ourselves into believing that there is a system that,
yeah,
you know, it's this or that. And I'm certainly looking forward to it because this is a sociology of accidents is absolutely necessary. Your question about historical observations of this too. I mean, a lot of historians deal with intentionality to some extent, like whether or not the history of
yeah.
something is intended or it is indeed an accident of events put together. That there are different kinds of theories on this, but I think necessarily significant to scholarship is a sociology of accidents because we need to understand the world in that way more than we need to understand it in terms of a system, a given system.
Well, I think that the two greatest monarchs that Britain's ever had were both women. I mean,
Hmm.
Elizabeth I and Queen Elizabeth, who died recently. And
Yes,
Elizabeth I was an amazing woman. I mean, she survived,
absolutely.
the Spanish attack, and
Yes,
all of her courtiers wanted to get her married, and so there'd be a king and an offspring, and
yes.
they wanted an heir to the throne,
Mm.
and she had a wonderful command of English. I mean, one of her
Mm.
phrases that's in my mind when she said, "I will not open windows on men's souls." In other words, that she wasn't going to pry into people's, religious beliefs. She's going to leave them alone.
Yes.
But I mean, the images of her are so, you know, well, if you're English, I mean, it kind of
Yeah.
these images are very much in your mind somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much.
And the last queen was, I mean, I didn't like her corgis and her, you know, she got a lot of things wrong, uh, but she was amazingly, steadfast and consistent.
Mm.
Uh, Took her job very, very seriously.
Yes.
Um, and I mean, she was she went through wars and all sorts of you know problematic things. So I mean, I won't get into the debate in America, Australia about whether Australia needs its own, get rid of the British monarchy and
Right. Yes.
have a presidential person.
Right.
Um, I think the arrangement has worked quite well for Australia,
Mm.
and we've had good prime ministers who've been, perfectly okay.
Mm.
But anyway, this is another story.
No, and I mean, you're right. It is. It is another story, but it's an important one as well. In terms of a discussion of sociology. Um, yeah, Australia has I guess the blessing and the curse of being the middle power, if you like.
And
Maybe.
also so far away from everything.
And so far, I think that's right. Curse and a blessing
Uh,
indeed. Um,
yeah.
I wonder if you might want to have any final kind of comments on what your I mean as a sociologist of religion, I've always been curious to kind of ask you a more broader question about religion in terms of how you understand religion sociologically, and from your lifetime of studying religion in its various forms, what do you
Well,
what do you take
technically,
religion?
I say there's been two approaches in sociology to religion. One is Durkheim and Mauss. I'll just call it the French tradition.
Right.
And then there was a German tradition, which was Jaspers, Weber,
Yes.
Levitt, Harnack, etc. And the Durkheim Mauss tradition was much more anthropological. I mean, the elementary forms of religious life, I think, is still the classic piece of sociology.
Yeah.
And essentially, it sees religion as a collective activity. And in what I'm writing at the moment, I mean, today I've just sort of inserted a note to say we must keep in mind that Durkheim and Mauss were socialists.
Right. Yep.
They they thought the individual was just a product of social arrangements,
Mhm.
and that uh, the only thing that was kind of real were communal activities. And so, in my recent work, I'm very critical of the idea of spirituality.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of sociologists say that, you know, uh, believing without belonging, or, the younger generation might not be formally Christian, but they're very spiritual.
Right.
And in this research we've been doing on Muslims at ACU, we found that while the Muslims face problems, they kind of try to solve these practically, not go out on the streets protesting and so on and so forth. And that they're doing well at university without, lots and lots of problems. So we're looking for these good luck stories about, successful Muslims, not failing Muslims. But spirituality for me is perfectly consistent with modern mobile individualism.
Mm.
And you don't need a community or um, any connection. I criticize it by saying, I walk my dog every morning at about 6 o'clock. We walk along the beach, and I'm very, very privileged.
Mm.
And I sit there and I think, I'm very spiritual
Oh.
because, the view across the bay to Sydney Harbour, and,
Mm.
when the sun comes up.
Oh,
I
so,
mean, well, when people say, "Are you spiritual?" I say, "Yes, I feel spiritual walking the dog." And then when I get home, I kick the dog because it's a nuisance, or I shout at my daughter for getting
right.
up late. So I'm not sure that spirituality influences my, regular life, and it's certainly not communal.
Right.
Uh, so I think Durkheim and Mauss got it absolutely correct.
Okay.
The elementary forms of religion are communal.
Right.
And that the German tradition is kind of, getting it wrong,
Oh, okay.
um, because uh, they didn't have this kind of anthropological sense of, you know,
Mm.
living in a community.
Right. So it's too heady,
Uh,
too conceptual.
yeah, I mean, you know, Bella, defines, religion as transcendence and, um, you know,
Yes.
thinking about thinking and so forth. In
Yeah.
other words, they converted it into a philosophy. So I've been reading this German theologian Harnack, who says that
Yes.
you know uh, the Germans turned religion into a philosophy, and so this contrast between the Durkheim Mauss tradition and the Weber, Levitt, whoever,
Mm.
Jaspers and so on and so forth, is very different traditions in the sociology of religion. So this book I'm writing on the Asian religion,
Yes.
compares these two legacies.
Okay.
Um, and well, I don't know. Have we already talked about the drum? I mean, uh,
Yes.
one of the key elements of shamanism was the drum, but the drum is, it's a collective practice.
Yes.
involving the whole tribe, becomes involved.
Yes, indeed.
So, you know, I can't, I can be spiritual, looking at the sun coming up, but it has no consequences.
Mm. Mm.
I could say it's entertainment.
Right. Right. I mean, this is consistent with generally, it's hard to say generally anything, but if I may go out on a limb, um, Christianity in particular, Islam, have a strong communal sense,
Yeah,
in which the sacred happens during a communal gathering, an assembly, if you
yeah.
will, the assembly of the church, or a community of prayer, and that certainly signals to me, at least, that there is the strength of that argument, wherein spirituality is very much a communal thing. Not that it isn't and can't be individual, or but it certainly has the strength of argument on that idea of the community. And
Well, I've
then,
forgotten the name of the woman that invented
mm,
believing without belonging. I can't remember her
mm,
name, but um,
the,
belonging without believing is not. Believing without belonging is has nothing to do with religion. It's just a private, you
yeah,
know, private activity.
it sounds to me about it's more like a. This is not a criticism of modernity or anything, but it sounds like a modern idea of the individual self and their place
Yeah,
within society and their right to do this and that, and obviously belief and faith, private prayer, private piety, all this sort of stuff. I think is is in a sense, again, I'm just kind of going out there a little bit, against the grain of traditional communal religiosity, spirituality. Yeah,
yeah.
would you agree?
Sorry, I've got a message here.
Well, that's okay.
Hello.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just saying, is that that's kind of your argument, isn't it? You're siding with the French tradition on that, that the religion is a communal thing. Otherwise, believing without belonging doesn't really
Yeah,
match up with a sense of religiosity. Did I read you
yeah,
correctly?
yeah. That's exactly.
Hmm. Okay, it's interesting, and that certainly makes sense about walking the dog and having a spiritual experience, and then coming home being angry about everything. I can relate to that
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. Well, the people that developed this theory lived and worked in the Lake District in England,
Mm,
and I don't know if you know that it's totally beautiful.
mm,
It's mountains, rivers. No wonder they thought, religion was spirituality because when you're surrounded by high mountains and birds flying and you
mm.
know nature looks wonderful uh,
Until it kills you.
until you kill it with
Or you kill it, yeah.
with
Uh,
the insecticide or something.
yes, that's a good point. Ryan, I've had a tremendous time having a conversation with you, and I realize you've got lots to do, and I appreciate your time. And again, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me, sharing your thoughts, your views, your personal experiences. It's incredibly rich and valuable to me.
Well,
Personally,
I hope I haven't sounded too arrogant. I mean,
not at all.
most of my good fortune has been by accident.
Not at all. I love
Um,
everything you say.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Okay, good to talk to you.